My name's Tim Forsman, and I'm an archaeologist from the University of Pretoria. Myself and a team are launching a 3-year program of research in the northern part of South Africa to investigate the role that hunter-gatherers played in local society. And I thought in this video what I could talk a little bit about is the importance of this work. Whenever we set up an archaeological program or a study, one of the crucial questions is always, what is it? Why is this important? What is the rationale? Why do this in the first place? So we all have our reasons. And in this talk, I'd like to speak a little bit about the reasons that I have to do this research. So the area that I'm talking about is called the Middle Limpopo Valley. You can see it here marked by a grey block. And although we're focusing on a limited space, this area was very much connected to a number of other landscapes around it. In this map, you can see a few sites that are marked off in eastern Botswana, but there's a lot of sites in northern South Africa, southern Zimbabwe, and also Mozambique that were connected through economic relations, political networks, and also social systems. But the valley itself that we're focusing on has a range of sites, and some of them are very prominent and well known. For example, Mapungubwe. So if you look at this map where the Shashi and Limpopo rivers meet, nearby there's a site there marked MPG, and that's the site of Mapungubwe. Its occupation was preceded by a site called K2 or Bambanjanalo, and that's just southwest of Mapungubwe by about 500 meters. Before this, Schroeder was the regional center. It was occupied from at least 8900 onwards during the Zizo period and a bit after that. But the sites I'm going to focus on are the hunter-gatherer sites, and the one that we're going to be excavating, and I have another video up mostly about this site actually, is Little Muck. That's in the middle of the map, kind of, LMS, Little Muck Shelter, and it's about 1.5 kilometers from LK or Liokwe Hill. To the west of this is Belerno Main Shelter, and south of that are Belerno Shelters 2 and 3, which I'll speak about. Another site I'm going to talk about is slightly further west and in Botswana. It's labeled MS. That's Mafunyane Shelter. And then more west from that is DS. It's the most western site we've excavated so far in this little area, and that stands for Zombo Shelter, and I'll talk about that briefly as well. Jao Shelter will also be on one of the maps, and that's a fascinating site, but I won't talk about that in this presentation. But this landscape has some really incredible archaeology, and it's very diverse. The period that I'm talking about is about 1220 BC until more or less 1300 AD. So it's a very limited period in time, and it's during this period that local farmer society developed state-level society, and they occupied Mapungubwe Hill, which was the regional capital. It's where there's intense social stratification, wealth accumulation, ritual control of the landscape, various other features that typified state-level society. And what I'm particularly interested in is how hunter-gatherers fitted into these networks, the kinds of spaces that they filled, the services they provided, the way that their knowledge system was drawn on by farmer society, and also how they participated in economic, political, and social networks that were occurring in the region. So if you have a look at these 3 images here, the middle image is of a rock art site known as Kwaka Shelter. That's a nice, beautiful giraffe that's been painted. It's a lovely site that you can visit in northern parts of South Africa. On the right of that is a photograph from Mamagwa Hill, which is an absolutely remarkable site that has not been studied nearly sufficiently enough in Botswana. And in the picture, it's at the end of the hill. You can see some cupules carved into the rock. It was used as a rainmaking hill at one stage. And it's a really very fascinating place. On the far left is a photograph of some stone tools and glass beads. Stone tools were produced probably by hunter-gatherers, and the glass beads come from Southeast Asia, traveled along the coastline of Africa, and eventually traded into the central part of southern Africa. So they've passed many hands before arriving in this part of the world. So the site that I'll talk about first is Belerno Main Shelter. This is a particularly large shelter that was excavated in the early 2000s. It was Bronwyn van Doornim's study site in her doctoral thesis, and it's a really incredible site. It has the oldest hunter-gatherer sequence we know of in the area so far, at around about 11,000 BC. No other site was occupied at that time that has been excavated thus far. And this site was occupied for about 5,000 years until 6,600 BC, when it was abandoned, and only reoccupied around 340 BC. And then it was consistently occupied until at least AD 1300, and then only much later reoccupied by farmers in the 1600s. So this site captures quite nicely the period that we're interested in, 340 BC until 1300 AD. And what's fascinating about this site is that originally, around 340 BC, it seems to have been occupied as what we'd probably call an aggregation site. Aggregation is a social system employed by Kalahari hunter-gatherers or San people who, at certain times of the year, come together in larger groups when they feast, go on hunting parades, perform rituals such as the trance dance, possibly producing rock art. They marry, and they also exchange gifts. So it's a very important part of their yearly cycle. And it's very important from a social perspective as well. So from what Bronwyn found at the site, she saw a lot of correlates between the archaeology and the material culture that was present in the deposit and the types of material culture that gets produced at aggregation sites. So she suggested this site form that service or function in society. So that was around 340 BC. Moving into about 2,000 years ago, so around zero, farming communities and herders started appearing in the landscape. Farmers a little bit later than herders, but by around 350 AD at least, there is a farmer presence in the extended region. The function and role of Bellona Main, as far as we can tell from the archaeology, changed insignificantly. There's almost no change. There are slight fluctuations in the density of artifacts or the frequency. There are slight changes in terms of what is represented. So suddenly bone tools might appear and then disappear. But by and large, the changes are minimal or very subtle. And that holds true all the way until the site was abandoned around AD 1300, suggesting that whoever was using Bellona Main changed very little, despite the massive economic, political, and social developments that were occurring on the landscape as a whole. So whether it was people coming to Bellona Main to live a more, let's call it, traditional lifestyle, or if it was a group of people permanently based at Bellona Main, the impact from the outside world seems to have not changed much at this particular site. That's not true for all sites, though. Very close to Bellona Main is Bellona Shelters 2 and 3. They're only 50 meters apart themselves. And here, the sites were occupied around about 2,000 years ago, so just before probably the arrival of herders and certainly farmer communities. There was an initial increase in artifact numbers, and from about the mid-first millennium, or even slightly earlier, somewhere around there, this starts to decline. And around 8900, when Zizo farmers arrive in the valley, and up until AD 1300, which is the decline of the Mapungubwe kingdom, it's very difficult to separate out what's going on. So in other words, it's all kind of mixed together. It's not possible to say these layers over here belong to the Zizo period, these layers K2, and these layers Mapungubwe. So this entire 8900 to 1300 AD period is seen as one phase in the site's occupations. And what's really interesting about that is that the hunter-gatherer sequences decline rapidly, suggesting possibly that sites like Bellona Shelters 2 and 3 became unfavored places. The foragers didn't want to, or hunter-gatherers didn't want to occupy and live in these spaces. They preferred sites like Bellona Main, or some of the other settlements that I'm going to talk about shortly. Across the river in Botswana, there's this site called Mafunyane Shelter. It was originally excavated prior to 1994 by Nick Walker. I then re-excavated it as part of my doctoral work. And at the site, there's some really interesting finds. B and C show off the rock art, which unfortunately is very faded. And D shows grooves in the rock, possibly for producing beads or metalwork. But in the sequence here, also the site dates to about 2,000 years ago, or from 2,000 years ago, there is, at some stage, around about 8900, there's this massive appearance of metal. A lot of metal starts coming up in the sequence, as well as broken tuyers, crucibles, which are both associated with metal production, and a figurine fragment as well. So it seems that at the site, while we have some evidence of metalworking, we also have a forager or hunter-gatherer presence. And in some levels, the density of archaeological remains associated with hunter-gatherers is greater than at any other site in the landscape. So their occupational use of this funny little space was not insignificant by any means. And at the same time they were using it, there is metal production going on. Now we can speculate. Were foragers and farmers both using the site, maybe at separate times of the year or together? Were foragers, if together, were foragers participating in the production of metal items? Since it's only metal production that's occurring at the site, no evidence of a farmer occupation or habitation, we could speculate that maybe even foragers were the ones producing the metal, had learnt this skill from farmers. This is all guesswork. We don't have any evidence really to strongly support any of these claims. But what's interesting about this site is that there are these two different sequences that co-occur inside this shelter. The true meaning of that is still open for debate. So here's another site that I excavated called Zombo Shelter. You can see the shelter on the left. It's not very large. On the right is finger-painted geometric images, and this was found behind the shelter in a very small overhang. The site was excavated in two areas, inside as well as outside the shelter. But unfortunately, we couldn't date the outside assemblage, so we couldn't relate what was happening outside the shelter with what was happening inside the shelter. But inside the shelter, we found a really interesting sequence. The earliest date we have is around 200 BC for this site, but that's well above bedrock. There's still a long archaeological sequence below that date, so we're not sure yet what the earliest occupation of this site could have been. But from 200 BC up until at least 1300, probably beyond 1300, maybe we have dates around 1400, 1450 at the site with hunter-gatherer material, this site was occupied. At around about 100 to 250, 300 AD, there begins an increase in the number of backed tools, and backed tools are part of hunting weapons. So they increase significantly and they come to dominate the formal stone tool category. This continues until at least 81,000 when their numbers decline and scraping tools dominate the sequence, which is more typical of these kind of assemblages. So because of this difference, the question was asked why? Why are hunting tools important? So when examining the hunting tools, now this is an assumption that's made that they were used in hunting, it was found that on many of them, 55% to be precise, there was diagnostic impact fractures, which are consistent with fracturing that you get on these kinds of tools from hunting practices. So if hunting was increasing, what's happening in the local faunal sequence? We looked at the bones inside the shelter. Not much. There's no significant change that occurred in the faunal assemblage. So if people were hunting more often, whatever they were hunting and collecting was not being brought back to the site. But what did happen at the same time was an increase in trade items, ceramics, beads, metal and bone tools as well, appearing at the same time that hunting gets preferred as an activity. So this seemed to suggest that hunting activities at this site may have been linked to trade with farming communities. Now farmers were living in the area. There's a number of farmer settlements around Zombo, but there's one major settlement called Mamagwa Hill, or here indicated as the Mamagwa Complex. And inside this settlement there was probably a large number of people living. Unfortunately, it hasn't been fully studied, but it was occupied from at least AD 900. Inside this little area is also Jao Shelter, and at Jao Shelter is a fascinating collection of glass beads, 150 glass beads coming from this small shelter occupied by hunter-gatherers. So Zombo is part of a broader landscape that was occupied by farmers, and quite possibly it's these farmers at Mamagwa and other settlements around it that the Zombo occupants were trading meat in order to gain things like ceramics, possibly milk or whatever may have been in those pots, if there was anything in the pots, as well as metal and eventually glass beads. Now Little Muck is similar in this regard. At Little Muck, here's some images. There's a friend of mine taking photographs inside the site and a visit we did some years back. Inside Little Muck, the excavations revealed a really interesting, also trade-linked sequence, following a very similar trajectory. From just soon after 2,000 years ago, in the early first millennium, there's this massive increase in scraping tools, not hunting tools, scraping tools. The early idea was that these scraping tools were linked to hide production. So we grabbed them all, stuck them under a microscope, and we looked at wear patterns along the tools, and we found that a lot of them, most of them actually, had been used in producing rigid materials, so possibly crafts made from bone or wood. So the idea is that people living here were producing a number of crafts, bone and wood, but probably also hide as well, because this is what scrapers were ethnographically used for. So again, like Zombo, people at this site, but on a much greater level, were focusing on the craft industry and using that to acquire trade wealth. Images on the left here are just two photographs of rock art. The top left one is a giraffe, or two giraffes, and here's a redrawing of that really beautiful image. Now, a lot like Zombo, Little Muck was also surrounded by farmer settlements. Ecologically, it's in a very similar context as well. It's occupied over the same period of time. These sites are about 27 kilometers apart. And here, the farmer complex of Leokwe Hill is about 1.5 kilometers away. And Leokwe Hill has a fascinating sequence of its own. It was occupied from at least 8900 by Zizo producing farmers, ceramic producing farmers. At about 80,000, K2 producers arrived and they lived at this site. And they started this really interesting interaction with the Zizo farmers. So these are two different groups of farmers that met one another. We can discuss the issues and the problems around ascribing identities here, but for the sake of simplicity, you had these two different groups that met one another and began interacting. And the result of their interactions is what we call the Leokwe farmers or Leokwe producers. And at the site, at the area marked A, which is on top of the hill, you had K2 occupations, but in the area specifically, I think it was C and D, you have a Leokwe presence. And in those areas, there's good evidence for craft production, and it also has a high density of kraal. So there's corralling going on of animals, so possibly herding for the K2 people. Tom Huffman's done some work in the Greefswald area where he found very similar evidence where craft and herding and possibly also ritual control was something that Leokwe farmers were doing. Up until that point, at least at Little Muck, some of those roles and responsibilities seem to have been the foragers' role, belong to the foragers. And so the interaction that happened between K2 and Zizo, which created this Leokwe group, that Leokwe group seemed to some extent have taken over the roles and functions of hunter-gatherers. And this is really, really interesting. We know very little of what was going on at that time with regard to this. And there hopefully will be a PhD coming out soon enough on this very topic. But at Little Muck, around the same time that K2 and Zizo people are interacting, the Little Muck archaeological sequence drops rapidly. And it seems possible that farming groups may have started using the shelter themselves. Determining this is based purely on the presence of certain cultural material. So, for example, what is usually associated with foragers or hunter-gatherers, that drops off, and what is usually associated with farmers picks up. However, if hunter-gatherers had started adopting farmer technologies and living as farmers, we would still see that same shift, and yet they would have continued to live at the shelter. So once again, it's something we don't know a lot about. We have some ideas, we have a sense of what may be happening here, but we need to really explore this in a lot more detail in order to figure this all out. And that's something we will definitely be doing. So trade and exchange was quite prominent and important at this period of time. So here, these are the stone scrapers that I've been referring to. B are the backed tools that I've been referring to from Zombo. D are examples of ostrich eggshell beads. E are examples of bone tools or bone implements. G is an example of, or two different examples of ceramics. F is metal or copper or iron possibly. And C, I've saved for last, are glass beads. And these things are quite amazing. As I mentioned earlier, they came from very far away. They came from Southeast Asia, and they were traded into this part of the world and became very important items. They were prestige items. They marked important people within society. And we start to find these in hunter-gatherer context, in combination with metal, in combination with ceramics, and bone tools as well as organic shell beads. So it's really quite fascinating that these wealth items that often mark prestige in society are appearing in hunter-gatherer context, possibly suggesting that hunter-gatherers themselves had access to wealth, to status within society. I'm jumping the gun here, but these are the kinds of things we're going to start exploring with this project. And these beads, 26,000 of them, I think, were found on top of Mapungubwe in one burial. So we're not talking numbers that compare in any way to what was occurring at Mapungubwe, but we are talking about some really interesting finds here, nonetheless. So this is an image of Mapungubwe on top of the hills where the beads came from. There were also gold beads, and you've probably seen images of the golden rhino, and if you haven't, I'd encourage you to look it up. It's an incredible find. And this is the site where the first state-level society established itself. But this establishment also wasn't an island. The landscape around it was populated by other farming communities as well as hunter-gatherers, and it's something we very seldom talk about. There are numerous studies on the rise of complex society in this part of the world, but a lot of them don't, and most of them in fact, don't acknowledge the fact that here, in amongst us, we have hunter-gatherers, and they were participating in this entire network. And this is a photograph that I love from National Geographic from years ago of hunter-gatherers in the Makadikari Pans. But the impression that we tend to get of these hunter-gatherers is that they are passive, they're on the outskirts. They were not necessarily active within these larger networks. And that's something that this research is challenging absolutely head on. In this study, we're arguing that hunter-gatherers were active agents within these networks, and they participated in economic, social, and political systems. They may have, even through these participations, been able to access their own form of status. They may have developed their own form of complexity, which we see in the different ranking of their sites. Inconsistent access to wealth. At Little Muck and Zomba, there's a nice accumulation of wealth items, which we don't see at places like Ballona, Maine, for example, or Ballona Shelter 2 and 3, which I showed you. Ballona, Maine, on the other hand, there's this massive consistency in the way it's occupied. A lot of the ideas around hunter-gatherers is that when they begin interacting with people like farmer communities, they become subordinates or serfs. They aren't able to necessarily continue practicing their own traditional ways that they would have done before. Yet at Ballona, Maine, that's not the case. People are able to continue living their lives in the same way or a very similar way to the way they were centuries before farmers arrived. And this is really important to this work, and this is why we're doing the study. It's to develop a deeper history of hunter-gatherers and acknowledge the important roles that they have played in the establishment of things like Mapungubwe and important political centers. Their role in a lot of these ideas and histories have been neglected and haven't really been spoken about. And that's something that we're addressing with the study. And it goes hand in hand with a bigger issue in South Africa. We need to rethink the way we see archaeology, and in some ways reimagine archaeology, and find how it best works for our context. In Southern Africa, indigenous communities are very often captured in the historic texts, and they become bounded by these texts. Hunter-gatherers, through these kinds of examples, are often portrayed as very simple people with little will for enterprise, innovation, or even change. But the archaeological record is finding more and more evidence that challenges these ideas and forces us to rethink who hunter-gatherers were. And that's the intention behind this. It's to challenge these notions of hunter-gatherers, and it's to examine the roles that they played within these bigger systems and how they participated and transformed as well in amongst these larger social interactions and networks that were taking place at the time of the development of Mapungubwe.